to take notes, that's fine, but you can also print out all the content in probably around 2 pages, you know, if you use the outline mode. So, yeah, okay. So now the thing is, one thing you got to see is when they're talking about virtue here, it's not just moral virtue, moral goodness, but when they're talking about virtue, they're talking about the character traits somebody should possess to live a really excellent life. Not only a morally good life, but you know, a life where they're a success as a person. Now, Aristotle discusses two types of virtue because he also thinks we, and you'll see reason plays a high, just like it did for Socrates and Plato, a big role in his views. So he says there are intellectual virtues. We should be curious about the world we live in. Aristotle was not just a philosopher who, like Socrates, was concerned with issues of how we should live. He was. Yes, he wrote the Nicomachean Ethics and the politics, you know. But he also wrote books on botany and physics. Now I guarantee you Aristotle's physics isn't going to look a thing like the physics textbook you had in high school if you took that subject. But he was interested in the world around him. I know one of the disappointing things I have about, you know, people growing up and I, you know, it was Uncle Vic who bought a computer for my only real nephew when he was 3 because I thought, you know what, this is going to be important for him to know. You know, now he's finishing up a college program in cyber security, cyber ethics, and could run rings around me in computer knowledge. But I recognized even back then it was important, you know. But I, you know, like when we had the eclipse, I just, it disappoints me that there isn't the curiosity about the world, the natural world we live in that I like to see. But at any rate, we're not going to worry about what he says about intellectual virtues, but moral virtue here. And he's worried, as were Plato and Socrates, more with what kind of person ought we to be if we're going to be a virtuous person, rather than as more secular ethicists today are worried about, well, how do we work out what's the right thing to do in this you know, critical situation in ethics. We'll look at utilitarianism that does try to address things like that. So it's acquired by habit, and often, just as Plato and Socrates thought we had a lower part of our nature, they you know, that deals with our habits for food, drink, sexual fulfillment. And they realize that very often moral behavior is something that we have to produce in ourselves contrary to what our inclinations might be. That is, that we might be inclined to go overboard in fulfilling our appetites for food, drink, and even sex. Or they thought that there's another part of us that has to do with our drives and our emotions. And they thought, well, sometimes being a moral person requires keeping control of our emotions. And we'll see this in Aristotle. Whether the emotion might be fear, and we need to keep it in control if we're going to develop the virtue of courage, or maybe the emotion is anger. So Aristotle is very practical. I have a little knick-knack shelf made out of wood that my dad made when he was in carpentry school. For most of his life, at least the latter part of it, he was a carpenter, in part a carpenter on a ship. But one of the things he was doing in building that shelf, which he built for as part of his training in carpentry school, was he was learning those skills. How many of you play a musical instrument? So not a lot of people. Well, that's interesting. That surprised me. Either that or people don't want to raise their hand. I used to play the guitar a lot. If you look at my left hand, you'll see how often I picked up the guitar recently. I used to have thick calluses because I was playing several hours a day on a steel string guitar. But the point is, skill at playing a musical instrument, Aristotle recognized, is not developed overnight. In other words, I can't go over to the library in back of us, check out a book on guitar playing or on, playing the keyboards or piano, and then book a gig for myself in a couple of weeks. It doesn't work that way. And so he says we become just persons by actually doing just actions, not by just contemplating what it would be to act justly. So his view is that we can develop these character traits, that they're not something that we're automatically born with. Plus, Aristotle is not a reclusive, lonely philosopher who goes off by himself and writes. But Aristotle's very practical. And he says, look, we don't become a just person, a moral person, by staying, going off into a lonely place and meditating on courage as a virtue, or meditating on, temperance. But he says we do it by interacting with our fellow human beings out there in the real world, in community. We become morally just by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings, So here's where Aristotle pushes the envelope. This model of a virtue is, as far as we know, something that he first came up with. Now, Plato and Socrates had talked about developing similar virtues, like courage, like self-control. And their thought is that this happens when we let the rational part of us take control, so that we moderate our behavior in the areas, say, of food and drink, or we moderate our behavior in keeping our emotions under control. We control our fear, to produce courage. But this insight that, a virtue, it may not be, well, you got virtue on one side and vice on the other side, and a virtue's at one extreme and vice is at the other. But for Aristotle, a virtue is the midpoint. I'm sure you remember, your teachers talking about the mean. It used to be the mean, the midpoint, right? When it comes to, say, grades. Maybe you had to learn how to work out the mean versus the median, in middle school or high school arithmetic. So in other words, Aristotle's insight is, wait a second, behavior at both ends of the spectrum is wrong. In other words, he says, if we want to be a virtuous person, we need to aim for the midway course between two extremes of behavior. The one is an extreme of deprivation, that is, say in the area of food and drink, just depriving us of what we need. On the other hand, he says, we want to avoid an extreme of going to excess. Now notice how this model is not what we're taught in by a lot of our popular figures, right? I mean, when I was young, there was a song, and I forget who had it, but that, you ought to live fast and die young, go to extremes. And of course, my generation, the boomer generation, has this history of rockers dying and for some reason they all seem to kick off at the age of 27. 27 for some reason seemed to be the magic number. But by the way, make sure if there's somebody who hasn't signed the roll, circulate that around, or at least come up afterwards. So Aristotle's going to say, no, the virtuous life is not one of excess in either direction. It's not going off and being an ascetic and denying all of your human needs, but neither is it taking things to extremes the other way. And some of the same virtues that the Greeks discussed were discussed in the New Testament as fruits of the Spirit. The thought is that somebody living a godly life in accordance with their Christian beliefs ought to have some of these character traits. Self-control. Anybody ever hear from history class of the WCTU? Well, this was long before my time, right? Those letters stand for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they were the ones, through their political lobbying, who were successful at getting lawmakers in the early 1920s to pass prohibition, right? The prohibition on the consumption of alcohol, right? But temperance, is not just moderation, say, in the use of alcohol. I mean, it's easy to see it on the side of excess if you're talking about alcohol use, you know. Basically, I mean, somebody being an alcoholic and not being able to control themselves, you know. But I'm not so sure that Aristotle, unlike, some people in Christian traditions, would have recommended total abstinence either. Asceticism is a point of view where you simply deny your body's needs, in the areas like food and drink, and even sex. So, but for Aristotle, that type of person is not really a virtuous person. To a certain extent, it says they're denying their humanity. They're taking things to the extreme of deprivation, which for him is not a virtue. Now, it's a little easier to see temperance on the other side of the coin as not being a virtue, right? Somebody who is a total glutton, lives for food, is 100 pounds overweight or something. I mean, it's easy to pass moral judgment on that type of person. But for Aristotle, the wrong courses of action are in both directions, not just one. So he recommends the mean, the midpoint between self-indulgence or gluttony and asceticism, the denial of our needs. I mean, these are some examples of virtues. Aristotle was very well aware of courage as a virtue, especially when it came to military situations. And you might think, well, okay, the really courageous person is somebody who has no fear at all. My dad's generation was the World War II generation. He never talked about his World War II experiences. There were other people who, like my Greek professor in college, would talk about them all the time. But when I've seen some of these people interviewed, about going into various battles, they were saying they were scared out of their wits. And they weren't ashamed to admit it. And Aristotle recognizes that courage isn't just not feeling fear. I mentioned my Greek professor. One anecdote he gave one time was he was leading a group of men in Europe, and they got in some new recruits, one of whom was very young, green, 18-year-old kid, right? This is World War II. Never been in battle before. And so they get into what the media loves to call a firefight. That's a euphemism for a situation where people are shooting rifles and machine guns at one another trying to kill each other. But calling it a firefight somehow sounds better. So, the kid is up there and he doesn't realize the capability of his enemy. So, he starts standing up and shooting at the Germans like he sees people in the movies doing, and gets shot himself. Well, I always thought that was a good example of having an excess of courage, whether you want to call it an excess of courage or a complete deprivation of fear is maybe verbal, But in other words, Aristotle is not saying, well, the real courageous situation is, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Is what was it? Andrew Jackson's famous comment in the Revolutionary War. Or behaving like that 18-year-old kid, and get shot yourself. Says that's just foolhardiness. Courage is not a complete lack of fear. In a much lesser, what part of learning how to play this little game backgammon at a high level, since the whole game involves decisions about when and where to take calculated risks to improve your position against your opponent. Part of learning that game is learning what situations are situations where a risk, maybe even a big risk, is justified and where it isn't. So, in other words, it's easy for us to see that somebody has no courage at all, who's cowering in fear, afraid to go over the hill when they're charging. It's easy to call that person a coward and somebody who's not exhibiting courageous behavior. But, Aristotle says, well, it's not a virtue on the other side. But the virtue of courage is feeling fear, experiencing it, but keeping it rationally under control. And this brings us to how does he expect us to moderate our behavior, to achieve this midpoint? The Greeks generally called this the golden mean. They valued a life of moderation. So the mean may be achieved contrary to what we want. I mean, just take a really mundane situation, right? Somebody 2 carols down from you just got an hourly raise, and you've been producing better numbers than they have, and you've even been here a little longer, and you realize you ought to go in there and confront your boss about that and try to get a raise too. And so your reason says, look, I had to do that. But you naturally don't want to do it, right? You have a resistance to going in there and confronting your boss, So your human nature says, let's put this off till tomorrow, Whereas your reason says, no, this is something you ought to do. You have, a good case for getting a raise, especially since, Mary 2 carols down did. So he thinks the way we achieve this mean in our behavior is by using reason. Now, here's where we get in to an area that is controversial, and has been controversial since the time of the Greeks. Both Socrates and Plato elevated reason. For them, the highest part of our nature was the rational part. That was the part that would put us in touch with the forms, right? That was the part that, would enable us to gain more knowledge and more wisdom. And if this way of looking at things seems a little different from you, it's because we're living after Darwin, right? But the ancients, and we see this even today. There are some philosophers who want to use reason as a way of drawing a line between human beings and every other animate thing on the planet, right? And this was Aristotle's argument, though. Aristotle believed in a view called essentialism, which Plato and Socrates also did. That's the whole point of the forms. In other words, take a triangle. Suppose I drew a triangle on the board with black ink, and then I drew another one with a red marker. And let's say I had a green marker also. I could go over there and do that, but the point is, it isn't essential to a triangle being a triangle that it be any one color, right? What's essential to its being a triangle, and this won't show up on the recording, is that it have 3 angles and 3 sides. I forget whether that's whether that's something you do for equilateral triangles. Again, folks, I took plane geometry in 1964 when I was a freshman in Poly, so some of this stuff leaves you. But so for Aristotle, things have characteristics that are unique to them and that define what they are. And sometimes the essential natures of things, I mean, let's suppose I had I'd brought in some walnuts here, which probably isn't going to happen, right? And I said, look, one of you lend me your cell phone here. I need to crack some of these walnuts. Let me give a couple of them a good rap with your cell phone. He said, that's not what it's made for, Plus, we might damage it. No, it's made, that's a device that's made for communicating over a cellular network, making calls, sending texts, da-da-da-da-da-da. Those pens that you're writing with, they have an essential function, right? Their purpose is not to make phone calls with. It's to write on paper. Whereas, you take one of those ballpoint pens and try to write on that whiteboard, and you're not going to have a lot of success, right? Its essential function is to enable you to write on things like paper, but you need a different implement, like that marker I just had in my hand. So what am I getting at? Well, for Aristotle, even inanimate things like, say, a knife, has an essential function that's an essential nature that's tied up with its unique function, right? If I wanted to take some notes, even if I had a penknife in my pocket, I wouldn't be taking it out to take notes with, right? Doesn't work so good. The essential function of a knife is to cut. Now, the same word, arete, that's used for the excellence of an inanimate object. In other words, if I let's say we were preparing dinner together and I needed to cut through a chicken bone or something, and I said, well, hand me that knife in the knife holder. I really need a virtuous knife. And that's a really virtuous knife to do this job with. You look at me like I was from the moon. We don't talk about inanimate objects like knives being morally virtuous, right? But we do use good in both a moral and a non-moral sense. Hey, he's a really well-behaved, good child. She's but we also, we use it in a moral sense, but we can also say, hey, look, I need to cut through a chicken bone. I need a good knife to do this with. And what I mean is one that's really sharp, it'll get the job done, and it'll perform the function it was meant to perform. And so the point is, for Aristotle, the essential characteristics of a thing, in other words, it's not essential, again, for a triangle that it be any particular color. That's what he called an accidental quality of a thing. But it is essential that it have 3 sides and 3 angles. And it's essential to something's being a knife that it be able to cut things. So the word arete, same word used for virtue, is used even in the Greek for inanimate objects that perform their essential function well. So for him, living a virtuous life is like living an excellent life. A virtuous knife, a knife that possesses arete, is a knife that performs the function of cutting excellently, right? So he says if essential natures are tied up with functions, he says, well, do human beings have an essential nature that's tied up with their function? And his answer is yes. So he tries to draw a sharp line between human beings and every other living thing on earth at the point of reason. He says, look, plants, they have biological functions, but they don't have awareness of their environment. They don't have an emotional life. Non-human animals, like my kitty cat, have both biological functions and an emotional life. And if the cat wants to be fed, she lets me know she's got an emotional life. Hey, where have you been? Your function is to come home and feed me. But for Aristotle, the ability to reason, to understand abstract concepts, to classify things in categories, to follow a rational argument, he says this is unique to human beings. So he says that thing, which for him, non-human animals do not possess those characteristics, right? Sentience is the ability to feel pleasure and pain, be aware of your environment, right? Plants lose out on both of those. Non-human animals have sentience, but again, for him, only human beings have reason or rationality. So he says, if we have an essential function as human beings, it's involved with reason. And so he says we're essentially reasoning beings. We saw that for Plato there was the form of the good. Remember, represented by the sun in the allegory of the cave. the standard for moral goodness. For Aristotle, the only way forms exist is in particular things. In other words, if all the desks went out of existence in the world, for Plato, there would still be a perfect form, a perfect blueprint of what a desk is to be in the realm of the forms. For Aristotle, if all the desks went out of existence, there wouldn't be any separate form of destiny. For him, there's no separate world that the soul goes to after death. So he can't say that the ultimate goal of morality is to know goodness itself better, the form of the good. For him, the ultimate end of moral activity isn't even a better afterlife. It's a better life here and now. He's convinced that we will have, the Greek word is eudaimonia, but it's often translated happiness. But it's not just being, oh, I'm happy, but it's kind of a deep sense that, hey, things are going well, life is good. My life is in balance, and it's where I want it to be. So for him, happiness is acquired, and it's desirable for its own sake, not just because it produces other things. He says ultimately everything is done for the sake of achieving happiness or eudaimonia. And how does he say we achieve this? Well, Aristotle's convinced that if we live a virtuous life, we're going to live a more excellent, well-balanced life than if we go to excesses. So for Aristotle, the payoff of ethics is not in the hereafter. We don't even think he thought there was an afterlife. But the payoff for him is here and now in living a happier, more satisfying life. Now, I realize, when I was your age, I don't think I would have bought that at all. But, as, I grow older, the people I know who seem to have it together and really do seem to live a happier life are the people whose lives, their areas of life are in balance, and they're living kind of a moderate life, not going to extremes, So I think, Aristotle was on to something. Now, I wanted to get through this, and I did. So for him, then, the happiest life is one lived in moderation. In other words, for him, the moral life is also the most satisfying life for a human being. Now, you can disagree with that, but at any rate, that's Aristotle's claim. Okay, so Friday, let's see, what are we going to do? Whatever's on the syllabus after Aristotle is what we'll do. But to repeat, folks, you got to try to get some Scantron forms before a week from Monday. They're like 43 cents at the bookstore. I always hate to ask people, but this has been the policy. Our department just does not have the budget to buy Scantron forms for everybody who wants to use them. They do sell them over the bookstore. The one you want is number 882, I think, ES. In other words, it's the little green one. There's a big red one that they use over in the sciences, Now, if you want to get the big red one, I'll ask you 200 questions instead of 30. But get the green one. Get all three of them, okay? So, Monday, which is a week before test one, I'm going to give you a sheet of take-home essay question options. And the only thing we'll do on the 9th is the objective part, the true, false, multiple choice part. on Scantron, but you'll bring your essay to class on Monday, print it out. So, okay. Well, we'll say more about that, but I'm trying to anticipate some things, help you plan ahead. Okay, thanks. Look, if you missed the roll, it is up here, and so sign it on the way out. Also, folks, I'm going to put this up as well as the other 2 editions. This is the 10th edition. It's going to be in 527. Feel free to borrow it, make copies, bring it back. Yeah.
Have you posted the extra credit yet?
That's a good question. I don't think I have, because there's usually a. Somehow I thought I had for your classes, but I'll look at that because it's a relevant question. Those options are usually there. There's a folder. Sometimes I wait to post it because I may want to revise it, but I probably will. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll double check. But the extra credit options are going to be in a folder on the menu in the Blackboard site.
Just want some extra credit.
Well, people can do up to 2 of them. Usually they involve watching a video and